Hello and welcome to episode 24 of the Ascension Speed Show. I'm Lyft, and I'm joined today by Captain Scotch and the Erosion Seeker. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining.
Hello.
No problem.
I did not have the opportunity to play Wildfire, so would one of you mind just describing briefly what Wildfire was?
The way that I have heard it described, which I think is probably the best way to describe it, is heavy rains but with fire. In the heavy rains path, every zone was underwater. In this path, every zone is on fire. The underwater mechanic kind of made items, as you got deeper and deeper underwater, become more and more prone to going away. Wildfire was kind of the opposite of that, in which it started at maximum fire in every zone. But you could send agents of the fire department in to douse the zones with water and lower the fire level lower and lower to kind of get your item drops back. Beyond that, the primary differences were there was a shop within the fire department that you could use to get a few useful things, mainly the blurt. Did I miss anything, Tess? I think that kind of covers all of the divergences there.
All of the important ones, pretty much.
Was this a path that had progression?
Not meaningful progression. So there's a counter in the quest log that tells you how much water you saved up over the runs, but other than that, the only progression is player skill.
I like it.
I was very happy about that, personally.
Yeah, progression could go away, and I wouldn't cry or anything. Here we have some notes about the theme. Was there more integration of the story snippets and what you would do in the gameplay that meshed in this path versus other paths?
A little bit. As you normally get in challenge paths, like all of the bosses were reskinned, with the obvious exception of Ed. The boss bat was the Blaze Bat. The Boner Dagon was the Burner Dagon. I think my favorite was Gror, became Gror except hot. In addition to that, one thing that I thought was actually quite cute was that in the path's kind of like fire department camp featured the return of the FDKOL auxiliary, which is something from, like 8 years ago, Tess?
Yeah, so in 2012, there was the Brush Fires event, which made the planes expand and change a couple of other things. Well, Fire Captain Hank is back.
It was a cute little, like, return of old lore that was not expected to ever be back. I was really happy to see that. I know that a lot of people thought it was really cute to just have kind of little tie-ins to events that were quite a while back.
I appreciate that. Now, did we already explain what FDKOL is? Was that part of the Brushfire event, or is that something else?
If I remember correctly, and it has been 8 years, the FDKOL is the fire department of the Kingdom of Loathing.
Oh, okay.
It's run by Fire Captain Hank, who came back as kind of like the person that would put out the fires in every zone during this path.
Miraculously, he didn't suffer any injuries from either the Brushfire event or this one.
I was pretty shocked about that. I was kind of expecting like at least some eyebrows singed off or something, but they're being nicer to Hank in his old age.
Well, we need to keep him around. I got a lot of stuff in there.
Exactly. The other big change to the path was that there were a lot of visual changes to KOL. So instead of the blue borders that you see on kind of every table in the main pane, everything was red in zones that were maximum fire damage. And there were little like burning fire gifs that would just sort of show up all over the page to represent the fact that you are fighting in a zone that is completely on fire. Did you enjoy that too, Tess? Because I thought it was really, really neat.
Yeah, it's really the small things that matter here, and I really hope the red zones that were part of this challenge path inspire changes in future challenge paths to do different things with different zone border colors.
I thought that it was just a really nice, like, visual... Wildfire felt like a different path. Even though a lot of the stuff was very similar, the red zones, the gifts, just like... It had just enough flavor that even though the powers that be didn't need to put a ton of effort into differentiating it, it really felt different in a way that I thought was quite neat and very fun.
Oh, it's fun to have a color linking a whole path theme in your mind. And so when you think red now in KOL, you'll automatically jump to Wildfire, which I think is really cool.
We had the Grey Goo path in 2020, and we had Wildfire now. So next year could be green or purple, or I don't know. Well, they'll need to come up with a color theme for the fall path next year.
Yeah, the next fall challenge path is going to be heavy winds, and then you get to play as a bean slinger again.
It's pretty good.
Compared to standard, what was the tools that made Wildfire unique and fun?
At the FDKOL camp, you were able to buy this large, bulky backpack called the Blart. It gave you 3 skills. One of them was not particularly useful, or at least during the path, nobody found a way to make it useful. But 2 of them were really, really cool. The first one, I'll go over the much simpler one, and Tess, you can go over the more complex one, was just Blart banishes. Very, very straightforward, very simple. It was just trade 100 water for a free run banish. Given that you could accumulate water as you adventured through the use of certain equipment items, this allowed you to generate, potentially bander levels of free runs in standard.
It was up to 1/8 of a free run every combat, which really stacks up when you have stuff like the Lianas and Drunk Pygmies.
How many free runs did an average run end up getting?
It kind of depended on how much you used the other main path feature, which I think, Tess, you called Blart Pockets.
All right, that seems like a good time to talk about these Blart Pockets.
So the second skill that the Blart gave you was to use 5 water on a pseudo pickpocket. And even though a lot of people dismissed this outright, it was a lot more powerful than people thought, because it was 5 water each time, and you could use it however many times you wanted in a fight until you got 1 item. So the main draw is that because Wildfire will destroy all of your regular item drops at the end of combat, everything that lets you steal items from the monster early, such as the Blood Pocket, lets you ignore that completely. So you can do things like snipe Stonewool from the sheep or Baba. You can get Bubbling Crudes without watering Oil Peak, and just generally use it on things that you want in zones that you can't justify watering. So to bring this back to what Scotch said, in hardcore I used only 12 wide sprays, which cost 1200 water, but I also used 103 narrow sprays. And out of that, I got 23 items that were useful for quests, in addition to maybe a dozen other items that weren't as useful, but were still good enough to justify using.
Yeah, that's incredible.
I just did the math on my log. I used 12 narrow sprays, it looks like, so 12 Blart Pockets and 21 free run banishes. You obviously used the narrows a lot more than I did, but it just was really, really cool and very powerful. It was weird because it was kind of the only real power level increase, but it was so strong that it didn't matter that it was the only one. It still was stronger than standard.
I'm bummed I missed this path because the mechanics look fun. I remember there was some chatter at the beginning. Purchasing the Blart was not cheap. How much was it? Was it really a big deal or not really?
Oh, it was a pretty big deal. I mean, it was one of those things where if you pulled a facsimile dictionary, you still couldn't get everything in the shop. It was very expensive. It's still, like, you got everything that you really needed, but it was a lot.
Oh yeah, it was 10k for a Blart, and 5k for a bucket hat, and 5k for a rainproof barrel cock.
And those increased the water per combat?
You were able to get a little bit of free water every day. I think it was just like 100. But if you spent the 5,000 on the barrel cock, you could get an extra 50 out of it, which was just, you're turning 5,000 meat into 1 banish, which is worth it, except you did have to wait on actually using any of the barrel water until you had bought it. However, you did really need the bucket hat, and you obviously needed the Blart. You needed the Blart to use the banishes or the pickpockets all together, and you needed the bucket hat so that you could start accumulating water so that you had water kind of sitting around and ready to go when you were ready to use it.
What were the major path restrictions?
Restriction-wise, I feel like the biggest one we've already touched on a little bit is just when the zones were at maximum fire level, you were absolutely not, like, you wouldn't get any item drops, period. Every item that is not a 100% drop or a quest item would burn up. It would just not exist. As you watered the zones, items would become sort of more and more likely to drop, finally hitting the sort of 0% flame rejection when the zone was fully watered. The thing is that watering zones was very, very expensive. So the more, it was one of those things where the more you did it, the more it would cost. And the cost ramped up so quickly that you really wanted to try and minimize the number of zones that you were watering.
When you watered a zone, did it put out all of the fire, or did it just reduce the fire level?
Reduce the fire level. You had to do, I think it was 5 waterings to fully remove the fire from a zone. But you usually would get like most of the benefit if you did just 4 waterings of the zone.
Was the damage that you took at end of combat significant? How much damage were we talking about?
So the other major part of the challenge in Wildfire was that you took fire damage every turn, including turns where the monster couldn't act, which meant that this was significantly more of an HP loss than Kingdom of Exploding, which just cost you a bunch of oxygen damage at the end of every fight. In turn, this means that if you can end a fight quickly, it's not too bad, but if you're fighting chain goblins from a pocket professor, you really need hot resistance to not die in the middle, as many people have done many times.
I think in this path, more than a lot of paths, you ended up having some people split their professor chain up because they just didn't go in with enough hot resistance and they realized that they were going to die like 3 or 4 goblins in.
How much hot resist was acceptable in order to fight the chain goblins? Did you have to stoop to crown tactics?
You didn't have to, especially when the fire extinguisher came out. Looking at the table, when a zone was at maximum fire level, which most of the zones that you would be backing up Professor into were, you would get 20 to 25% of your max HP and hot damage every turn, which required a considerable amount of hot resistance to make low enough that you could actually do like a normal Professor chain.
I think I was at like 16 or 17 hot resistance for the chain.
You had to push it really, really high. It was pretty difficult, honestly. Like that was actually an interesting combat puzzle, I thought.
Was there any super unique hot resistance sources that you used?
I think the only one that I did was I tried to make sure that all of my professor chains happened while I had the +5 hot resistance daylight shavings buff on. But I don't know if you had anything else that was like particularly useful there, Tess.
I think I just used the vampire cloak swish for an extra 2.
So you mentioned that you guys normally watered a zone about 4 times. So how many zones did you end up having to water over the course of a run?
In softcore, I think you ended up watering less. In my run, I only watered 3 zones. I watered the airship, the battlefield, and the middle chamber in the pyramid. I actually didn't even fully water the middle chamber. I think I only did like 2 levels of that because I really wanted to try and cheese the blart banishes as much as possible.
I forgot to ask, how much does watering a zone cost?
It was 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on.
Which got very expensive. I mean, by the time when you do 4 waterings, that already gets you past 1 banish done.
Oh, and it's total per day, not per zone.
Did the fires kick up again after rollover?
Thankfully not.
However, the cost did reset, so there was some interesting math on figuring out like exactly how much you wanted to do day 1 versus day 2, etc.
Although to be fair, even if the fires did come back the next day, the quote correct routing would have made you not go through the same zones on both days anyway.
And what about in hardcore? What was your watering like, Tess?
So in hardcore, I did 4 airship, 2 nook, 4 Sanofa, and then day 2 it was 4 battlefield and 4 middle chamber. Sanofa seems like a really weird choice because it's a zone where you are fighting lobster frogmen, which have a 100% drop that does not get burned by the fires. But because I used 2 Nost spits and I needed the extra gunpowders, I thought that was a decent middle point.
Creative.
I could see that, especially if you just had like the sabers there. It just made it really easy for you to nostalgia things into there.
It is kind of surprising that you in hardcore only watered 3 zones, but I sense that you used a lot of tricks.
I think it's a combination of like we both use tricks, but we also just the way the path works with the exclusion of 100% drops in quest items meant there actually aren't that many items you really needed. It seemed like something where the amount of water we would need to use when I first heard about the path would be ridiculous. And then I really just started doing the math and was just like, oh no, you can saber this. Oh, you can use, the blart pockets for this. You can use a polar vortex for this. And then suddenly what looked like an impossible problem was actually really easy to solve with a small combination of like shinies, some clever routing, and our best friend, the retrospecs.
Ah, yes. So I've heard, why was this the path of the retrospecs?
Yeah, so the retrospecs are just normally a fun but incredibly difficult to use item because you want to cap drops and if you do that, you're not going to get the benefit off of it. But because Wildfire destroys drops that you would have gotten, this gives you a lot more opportunities to recover those items. So it's not reliable, but in a couple of zones, you can kind of weigh your chances on what you can grab off of them.
There were a bunch of spots where it was just sort of like, it wasn't entirely reliable, but it was so close that, especially in softcore where you had like extra seals and you could use Liana to roll for stuff, like I I feel like in this path it was like a B tier item of the month at a minimum. It saved me a ton of headaches just like pulling a bunch of items into different zones. I didn't need to do anything special to get the skeleton key. It was just really, really neat.
So I grabbed 25 items off of the retrospects, 8 of which were essential. I put the list down and it was stuff like the Enchanted Bean, the Amulet of Plot Significance, the Stone Wool was really good. There was also Red Box Glark Cable, and I also grabbed a Stunt Nuts off of it.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean some of these, like the Enchanted Bean, I think is like what, 50% or something. I mean, in Oil Peak there were
Oh, there was also Ore.
oh yeah. Or was also very because the other thing that was really, really frustrating about this path was that you couldn't like if you were to fight the mountain man was in no zone, so there was no way to water it.
Oh.
Can't saber the pantsed one, but you can polar vortex, and you always get at least one out of your retrospecs.
Yeah, so the traditionally accepted way to get ore in Wildfire was to hit the Cargo Mountain Man with 6 or 7 industrial fire extinguisher charges. I thought that was too much, so I put on the retrospecs, which would almost guarantee 1 ore from it, and I also used the Blart Pocket on it with the intention that even if they were the wrong kinds, I could always try to zap for it, and then at last resort use a clover in the mine to get the final one if that came up.
That's really neat. So retrospects jumped in value considerably. What items of the month kind of dipped in value in Wildfire?
I think there are two. I'll cover one of them. The core one that I think was really painful to me was Camel. Obviously, spits are still useful in this path. They're getting you more items that you would need, but because you had to put your spits in zones that you had fully watered, you were much more limited on where you actually could put them. In my run, I actually did do 8 specific. I did 8 spits, which was quite a lot, but without the saber, I don't think it would have been possible. There's absolutely nothing else that was. I don't think that I could have done it without saber at all. So this was a path where camel was still useful, but it was so much harder to use that I would probably like if this was someone's first path with the camel, they probably would come away thinking that it was way too fiddly and not really usable.
The 2 candidates I have for items hurt by Wildfire were the Scrapbook and the A Union Crown. So the Scrapbook was an offhand that you normally want taped to your offhand because it would give you plus experience and familiar weight and so on. But the Water Candle was just by far and away a better offhand. Instead of getting 1 to 3% of a banish every turn, the Water Candle always gave you 3, and it also gave you hot resistance, which was useful for survival. And then the other one, which was the Ionian Crown, suffered the exact same problem, except the literal bucket hat was even better. It gave you 5 water every combat, which would either be worth 1 Blart Pocket or 1/20th of a banish, compared to whatever the Ionian would give you, which is basically nothing if you aren't using a horrifying 1-day stunt run.
So, Tess, you discovered something really, really cool related to how to turn one of the fire extinguisher tricks free. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
So for the fire extinguisher, in addition to its 5% and 10% charge uses, once per ascension, you can also spend 20% charge on one of 5 zone-specific skills. And each of these would result in a free run, except for the bat hole one, which opens up a zone. But then it turns out if you use something like stuffed mortar shell and you attempt to kill the monster on the same turn that you use the constricted blast, that just turns it into a free combat.
Bat hole use of the fire extinguisher was the only one that didn't give you a free run. It just opened up another passage in the middle of the combat. It's just so cool.
It was really cool. I mean, I think that it's super spaghetti code type nonsense, but I really feel like the way it worked was just the rest of them were coded to end the combat. That one wasn't coded to end the combat. And Tess figured out in his infinite wisdom there, what happens if we end the combat on the same turn? Does it work the same way? And I just think that is one of the coolest little spaghetti code tricks that we found of late.
I agree.
It's also just generally useful because when you're trying to get a sonar, it's a 10% drop versus the enchanted bean, which is 50%. And that's just a really bad gamble to put for polar pockets. And this just gives you 100% chance to open up that zone for only 2 charges.
One other thing that I did want to at least like bring up as one small kind of weirdness in Wildfire was that there were a lot of like combat ending tricks where you actually could still get some water from it. It was somewhat similar to the familiar scrapbook in that way, if I remember correctly.
You got water at the end of combats, no matter how they ended, which included victory, defeat, runaway.
Funny thing about this to me was that it meant in my run I got 20 blarts. With those 20 blarts I was getting 8 water every time I did the blarts, so basically I generated another banish from all of that, or actually like a banish and a half from all of those.
Yeah, that's neat. Tess, do you want to explain to me another cool interaction between the retrospecs and the Blart Pocket?
So this was something I found maybe in the last couple of weeks of the path, and it just completely changed how I had to plan retrospects and Blart Pocket. What happens is that when you Blart Pocket an item, it counts as failing to drop instead of being a regular pickpocket. And what this means is that that the retrospects thinks that you didn't get it to drop, and so it tries to let you remember that item. No other pickpocket in the game works like this, and so this means if you blart a stone wool, you can retrospect to get a second stone wool. You can do this for the Mountain Man. You can do this for oil cartels. It's completely crazy.
That's really cool.
The way that Blart and Retrospects interacted was super, super neat, and I feel like we didn't fully, like, this was one of the sort of, like, tragedies of Wildfire, right? Like, a lot of people didn't play it, and as a result, there were a lot of really cool strategic things that were discovered in the last, like, what, 2-3 weeks of the path?
And this might be a bit of a tangent. Was Cleash broken or relevant?
It wasn't strictly more relevant than it is in Standard. The one nice thing about it was that the only item that drops from your Cleached monster is 100% drop, so you'd still get it. I think the weird thing about Cleash, and kind of Cleash in combination with Wildfire, is part of what sort of made this line of thinking become more and more relevant in the late year runs, was like Wildfire made us realize how few items we actually need from a run. And when you combine that information with the fact that, oh, you can use cleach to extend the range of things like nostalgia and things like spits, etc., um, it made it very, like, it kind of made things click for a lot of people. Like, oh, I should really be cleaching a lot more. Like, I think in Cannon's late year runs, I think he used cleach like 20 times. I think I used it 30 or 40 times in my last one day of the year. Like, it was very much a. I don't think that cleach was better in Wildfire than it was elsewhere, really, but the like dynamics of the Wildfire path made it a lot more obvious how you could use cleach in degenerate ways in normal paths, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Now that's really neat. I hadn't actually considered the part about preserving like a backup monster or a nostalgia target using cleach.
There are some really degenerate ways to use it. I think Cannon was talking about potentially like cleaching enough monsters so that you could just you know, spit something onto a grop and then spit the grop that you had encountered onto something else, which is very funny and also alarming to think that you're just cleaching 20 combats in a row. But as you find in Wildfire, like it's not that hard. There aren't that many items you actually need in a run.
Scotch, did you have any weird pulls or a pull that was a standout for you?
I'm gonna be honest, my pull list was pretty vanilla. I think that the main two big things that were kind of increased in value was anything that let you skip a zone. So the Muculent Machete was really nice. The Blackberry Galoshes were cool because I didn't need to use a saber to try and force them, but that's usually useful in a normal path, so it's not that big of a deal. Smut Orc Keepsake Boxes were really useful. And then the Claw of the Infernal Seal, like, it's often a reasonably good pull. It gets you, or at least in this meta, it got you kind of like an extra Powdered Madness, but you would also get something better from it, which is, another 10 combats of getting water, another 10 combats to roll for retrospects targets. Like, given the power of retrospects in this path, just having more fights that you could use to roll retrospect stuff was actually really, really nice.
80 bonus water a day.
Exactly, and 80 bonus water. Like, it just was like, there was a lot of good stuff on that. And then the other one, which I think I mentioned before, was just pulling a facsimile dictionary. That's often like the quote unquote lazy pull. But in softcore, I think it's just absolutely right to pull it early. Like, that means you don't have to worry about routing meat zones. It means you can properly use the boss bat chamber as delay. There were just a lot of good elements to that one.
And your run was 2 days. So was one day not possible?
I think one day was possible. So Thoth attempted to do a one day on the last day of the path and came really close. I believe he told me he was about 20 turns short. When I finished my softcore run, I had suspected one day was possible, but like, once you got to a turn count of 260, which is what my gold ended up being, like, that obviously can be a one day, given the amount of turn gen that we had in last year's meta. You add on a lot of turns to do a one day, obviously, but like, if you can get the run done in 260 turns in 2 days, you should be able to make a one day work. It's still difficult, as evidenced by the fact that Thoth did not pull it off, but I think it was definitely possible. It just was one of those, like, again, a lot of people just weren't super interested in the path, unfortunately, and there weren't a ton of people trying for one days.
I wish this path almost had of released in a different meta, because I think, as we've discussed before, it might not have been the path, but just the combinations of items of the month in play that made it less popular.
I think that's possible for sure. What do you think, Tess?
I think this was probably one of the better metas for it. If you're looking at item of the month years and even inserting the extinguisher into one of them, it's not like 2018 or 17 would have been very much better.
For me, the big issue with this path was it was relatively high degree of difficulty, but that's kind of true of everything in the modern meta, which meant that the path, despite having some frankly very powerful mechanics and very fun flavor, just didn't seem to catch on that much. I think partly just because a lot of people weren't running a ton of Ascensions last year. I know in November when the Vintner came out, there were a lot more people doing Vintner stunts than actually wanting to run Wildfire, which I thought it was cute because the Vintner is cute, but it was a little sad because I don't think this path quite got the love that it would have deserved. I thought this path was really fun, just to be clear. I thought this path was really interesting. It had really fun optimization. The fire extinguisher was a little bit cheesy for it, but overall, like, I had a lot of fun with it and thought it was really neat.
Well, it does that thing that a lot of paths do where they take away a lot of stuff, and then if you're kind of smart about it, it gives you most of that stuff back. And I think the initial the initial loss just scared away too many people.
I think that's true, yeah. I think a lot of people, when the path originally dropped, were just like, oh, wow, you don't get any items. Every combat, you have to try harder. This seems crazy and impossible, and I don't want to do it. And as the strategies were kind of figured out and mulled over, people just didn't kind of like dip back in and go, oh wait, this path actually isn't that bad. Let's go back into it. I think that's super fair.
So it sounded like you guys had fun with the path.
Yeah, it was a challenging path that didn't need 11 lead-ins, so that's good enough.
Yeah.
The lack of lead-in run was so good after QT and Robot in succession.
Any other things we want to talk about with Wildfire?
I think Fred wanted us to advertise how great the industrial fire extinguisher is because he invested in a lot of them. I guess we actually didn't really do that very much, but that's fine. I thought the fire extinguisher was a little bit cheesy. It kind of trivialized like the combat structure in this path in a way that I thought was both like it was nice in the sense that I didn't need to focus on it that much, but I thought it was actually kind of a fun puzzle, so I wasn't super keen on that.
And for those that don't know, the fire extinguisher
Completely negated fire damage.
And had double use in this path.
The double use was just sort of like, wait, what? Okay, sure. Again, like, it's a great item of the month. I love the fire extinguisher. It just was very much like, oh, okay, you just added like 2 somewhat overpowered pieces of additional use here. Like, I honestly thought that like if they hadn't added the fire damage negation, the like plus 30 hot resistance would have been a interesting skill to use, right? Like that actually might have gotten some play.
Like, if you want to minimize Pocket Professor combats, you wouldn't want to use the extinguisher anyways, because the saber gave you plus 10 weight.
Yeah, that is true.
I think the damage negation is fine, because for the one fight that it mattered in, you didn't want to have it equipped anyway.
What one fight are we talking about?
The Goblin Chain.
Got it. I guess you'd equip it because why not for the sorceress?
Yeah, it was good to have on for the sorceress too. I think the other place that it was potentially useful was like if you didn't have a great strategy for the war boss, it was kind of nice to just be able to like cheese that combat by having that on. But yeah, I think like those are the 3 that really mattered.
Well, congrats to both of you for the gold stars. Excellent runs.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was very proud of mine. Sad that this path didn't get as much interest as even I think QT had a little more interest than this, which I was kind of sad because like QT was really interesting, but I thought this path actually ended up being a little bit better balanced and a little bit more fun.
From what you guys are saying, it sounds like Wildfire played better, whereas I think the initial pitch to QT just sounds like it's more fun than it actually is.
I think you would have liked this path.
I think I really would have liked this path. I'm kind of bummed. We actually recorded it before the next path was released too. So that's a win.
Barely.
Yep.
Yes.